Welcome back. In this session, we're going to examine the research process and problem definition. Let's begin with the former, the research process. But before that, a quick review. Bear in mind there are two broad approaches to marketing research. One that favors ongoing marketing intelligence. This is the kind that tries to monitor customer behavior on a constant basis, tracking statistics like number of products purchased, online activity, web activity, customer satisfaction on a continual basis. On the other hand, there is a more traditional view of marketing research that looks at a problem-solving orientation. According to this view, marketing research is only conducted in response to and identifying a problem. It follows a research project approach where the project is structured into a sequence of steps called the research process. And here's what it looks like. So you formulate the research problem first, determine the appropriate research design a data collection method, design the sample and gather data, analyze, interpret it, and finally prepare a research report. Now, it turns out that even if you're doing ongoing marketing intelligence, many of these steps may be followed, but not as linearly and as categorically as it does in this problem-solving oriented approach. And therefore, this research process can be thought of as applying to both approaches to marketing research, the ongoing as well as the problem-solving oriented approach. Let's begin by unpacking each step now. The first step is about formulating the problem, identifying or clarifying what is the problem in more clear terms. You've no doubt heard the adage, defining the problem is a problem well solved, well defined. A research question asked well is half the problem solved. It is quite relevant in this case also. Oftentimes it is really hard to identify or uncover the exact nature of the problem. And so typically what might happen is a lot of effort might be spent in in formulating a problem. This might be made possible by conducting a number of in-person interviews with stakeholders, conversations with customers, looking at secondary data. All these might eventually help define and formulate the problem. Once the problem is formulated, then the researcher must decide on what design to use to address the research problem. This could involve relying on secondary or existing data, gathering primary data by way of qualitative or exploratory approaches, survey-based or descriptive approaches, or experimental or otherwise known as causal design approaches. The data collection itself may involve either primary data gathering or secondary data gathering. Frequently, we rely on a subset of the population for gathering data. This is called a sample. And the next step then involves defining or outlining the nature of the sample, and then going ahead and gathering data. Once the data has been gathered, the next step is to organize or prepare the data. This might involve downloading the data from some survey platform or qualitative coding platform, and then analyzing it using appropriate software and interpreting the results. Once this is all done, the ultimate goal of a research process should be to be able to make a difference for the findings to promote action by stakeholders. This is made possible by putting together a report, preferably one that promotes actions, one that's easy enough to understand and simple enough and lucid. Let's drill down now into each one of these in more detail, beginning with the first one, formulating the problem. So here's a common personal experience I've had. This is obviously anecdotal, but it's symbolic of the kinds of questions I frequently get. Here's one where somebody calls up and says, we have some really good data collected from 10,000 or so shoppers. Here's a questionnaire we use. Can you help us analyze this? My response to this frequently is, it's great you got this wonderful data, but do you know why you gathered the data in the first place? What was the purpose behind gathering the data? Knowing the purpose is really important. Now, I don't want to get all statistical on you and say you need to have a hypothesis in place. But yes, a hypothesis does help. But even when a problem isn't clearly articulated, having some expectation of what the purpose is helps inform the research process, helps inform analysis. So having some thinking behind why the data was gathered helps us identify what we're looking for more easily. I'll give you one really good example here of the data mining view and the more research-oriented view. So a couple of years ago, the Social Security Administration made available more than 100 years of a database of names in the United States. Data scientists predisposed to jumping into the data and looking for golden nuggets went in and did all sorts of interesting things with the data, which includes finding out the top 5 names by state, and so on, what have you. They found some interesting things, no doubt. They looked at exotic names and found out that certain names spiked in certain periods, like Katina spiked around 1970. Jalen spiked at a different period of time. So they were able to find some interesting things like names that became, poison, so to speak, names that have become very popular of late. For instance, Emma has been a very popular name in the last 10 years or so. So you can expect in about 10 years or so time, pretty much every college student will be called Emma, Olivia, or Sophia for girl names. So all these wonderful things emerged from that data mining experience. Now, that's cool. It's really eyebrow raising, and it draws a lot of attention when shared in a blog or in social media. But exploration is not a goal. There has to be some sort of an idea where you're going when you jump into the data. And that's the part about articulating a problem. Sometimes the data lands up on your desk and you think about the problem after the fact. Not what a statistician would like to hear, but that's okay if you, at least at that late stage, articulate the problem. Bottom line, defining the problem, even if after getting the data, is a good idea. In the case of we just looked at, you can consider now that you have the data sitting in your lab, think about what kind of a problem might marketers have that this data might address. For instance, a common question that marketers have is knowing more about their customers, because marketers reason the more they know about their customers, the more easily they'll be able to satisfy their needs and therefore make them loyal customers. The question then is, can we use this SSA data to analyze the name of a person? And what would we learn from that? Now, if you think, you can pause this video and think about it for a second. What could you possibly learn from a name? Can a name of a person tell you what gender they are? Can merely knowing the name of a person, imagine the name a company has on a customer database, inform them about the age of the person? Think of a name like David versus Ty. Do these names suggest a certain age to you? Is Donald an older person or younger person? What about Max? Right? What about Daphne or Hillary? So it is, of course, possible. And so somebody actually did the analysis and they said, well, here's what we can do. We can look at the frequency of certain names over the 100 or so years of history we've got for the name database. And we can identify, for instance, Brittany was peaking as a very popular name in 1989, which means in, let's say, the year 2022, the average Brittany would be 33 years old, you say? So if one has no information about Brittany whatsoever, one can, based on this data, make some guesses about their potential age. It doesn't have to be that every Brittany in the database of a company is 33 years old, but there's a pretty good chance the age is in fact 33 if they're, most of them are born 89. This may, of course, may not work for every name, like a Joseph. We shouldn't have a clearly defined peak for the name. It might be much harder to identify than for a Joseph what the age of a Joseph is. But generally speaking, you can look at the frequency of by which names were signed over time and learn that, let's say, a Joshua is generally younger than, let's say, a George or a Donald. Amongst women or girls, Emily and Ashley are generally going to be younger than, let's say, Carol, Barbara, Ruth, Frances, Helen, Betty, or Dorothy. Right? Okay, so the first step is formulating the problem. Preferably should be done before getting a hold of the data, but if somehow it turns out that data lands in your lap, it's okay at that stage to still think of the problem the data might solve before jumping into the data. And so here's some more thinking about this idea here. Problem formulation is about something that needs to be fixed or a new opportunity, right? So you want to think here hard about, again, what is it that the problem might potentially fix? Is there some sort of a change in the market environment? It's unanticipated that has prompted the problem, or is something that's planned, like a company planning to launch a new ad campaign, a new product launch, new pricing strategy, or is there a new idea that's being tested out here? Bottom line, clearly and accurately define the problem, distinguish symptoms from problems. You can address all problems, identify the ones you can. Bear in mind, not every research problem is worth pursuing, because pursuing a research project can cost a large amount of time, effort, and money. So only the ones that are worthy should be pursued. And ultimately, you should be able to translate a decision problem into a research problem. Okay, so it's really important to clearly define the problem. We already understand this part. So a bit more about that then. The way to clearly define the problem is to do some qualitative research, let's say, with customers. It could be involved something somewhat quantitative, like reviewing secondary data gathered by the company, or it could involve discussions with decision makers, even experts. For instance, a company that's going out to many years ago, Domino's experienced a decline in customer satisfaction, and they were trying to figure out why their pizza wasn't as popular, wasn't seen as being popular anymore. And they found they dug deeper to define the problem more clearly by having conversations with their customers and focus group interviews and so on, which ultimately led them to identify the problem for their declining sales and customer satisfaction as being a product quality issue. Let me give you a little, share with you a little anecdote here. It's the rock project story. And here's how the story goes. A certain rich person decided to go and buy a mountain. And having bought the mountain, he now decided to hire an analyst. He told the analyst, "I spent a lot of money on this great big mountain, and I need you to bring me a rock from this mountain that makes the expense worthwhile." The excited analyst said, "Surely, I can do that." Analyst headed out to find a rock. And of course, came back with a rock And the decision maker then said, well, that stakeholder says, that's a good rock, but it's not quite the rock that I'm looking for. So the analyst asks, well, what kind of rock are you looking for? The stakeholder said, well, it's a rock. It's an important rock. So analyst went back to the mountain, looked for an important rock, came back with an important rock she thought was important. The stakeholder looked at the rock and said, well, this is a really good rock, but not the rock I'm looking for. The analyst asked again, so what exactly does an important rock look like? The stakeholder insisted that it's a special kind of rock. You'll kind of know. And analyst went back to the mountain, dug a lot this time, dug deep, and finally found a rock. She couldn't believe she had, not taken the trouble earlier to dig deeper to find this rock. Having found this rock, she went back to the decision maker and showed the rock to him. He looked at the rock and said, wow. She was happy for a moment, but it only lasted a moment, because the rich stakeholder then said, this is a good rock, but not what I'm looking for. At this point, the analyst started getting a little impatient, and so was the stakeholder, getting frustrated. So the analyst asked, this time more strongly, what kind of a rock are you looking for? Could you be a bit more specific? And the decision maker said, well, it's none of these rocks. It's a very special kind of rock. And they went back and forth like this. She would go back to the mountain, take up a rock, come back. He would reject it. Eventually, the stakeholder's patience ran out. So did the analyst. The stakeholder thanked the analyst for her work and sold the mountain. Hopefully you can see the point here of the story. All the going back and forth to the mountain by the analyst would have been prevented if only the analyst had, after getting the data, mountain, shared with the analyst exactly what he was looking for. If she knew what he was looking for, she could have been more surgical in locating that particular rock. But without this information, it was really hard for her to find the rock. Bottom line here is, it is critically important to define the problem, because defining the problem informs all further and future decisions, from what design to use, to what data to gather, to what sample to use, and lastly, how to analyze that data. It is important to distinguish a symptom from a problem. A symptom may signal a deeper problem, like a decline in sales. It's usually a signal of a deeper problem, like, say, a product quality issue. So as I noted earlier, a researcher cannot address all marketing problems. They need to identify whether research can offer a solution, and only pick and choose the problems that are worth pursuing. Not every problem is worth undertaking a research project for. And ultimately, one must be able to translate the decision problem into a research problem. Here are some examples of decision problems. Develop package for a new product. That's the decision the CEO wants to make. As far as the researcher is concerned, their goal is to evaluate alternative package designs and identify the best package design. If the decision problem is increase store traffic, the research problem might be how to do so. Thus, we're converting a managerial decision problem into a data problem here. A research problem then can be loosely thought about as being a data problem. Consider the last problem out here. Decide whether to switch from clicks and mortar to completely online. The research translation would be, determine consumers' shopping preferences or measure consumer shopping preferences. Okay, let's move on to examining the approach to the problem. The approach to the problem involves clearly defining an objective or theoretical framework, analytical model, and research questions and hypotheses. Now, not all of these may be required. A researcher may decide to do one of these three in thinking about the approach to the problem. The objective or theoretical framework has got to do with looking at existing theories to inform the research project. This could involve identifying what we already know that might inform the research project. For instance, if the goal is to examine advertising or come up with a new ad campaign, one would benefit from knowing what we have learned about advertising research. For example, knowing about the historical or study or research relationship between advertising and sales. How exactly does advertising affect sales? Is it a linear relationship, a nonlinear relationship? Is it a step function? An analytical model might help some get a better grasp on the problem. This might be structured as a verbal model, like advertising drives sales higher, but only to a certain point, after which the effects of advertising level off. Could be box and arrow model, or it could be a graphical model. The graphical model is showing you as advertising goes up, sales go up rather slowly, then they pick up and the graph almost becomes vertical until threshold B, at which point the sales will level off. There's also the mathematical formulation of the same thing. All these are different ways of saying the same thing. They're all saying advertising increases or sales increase with advertising rather slowly, then they pick up and they level off eventually. A company deciding then on an ad campaign or intensifying their ad campaign might benefit from this existing knowledge base. They would then know just from prior research what they should do with their ad campaign. They may not need to even go forward with a research project. Or maybe now they can have more focused specific questions for the research project. It helps to break a big problem into smaller pieces. One way of going about that is to break the research down into components and then into research questions and hypotheses. Research questions are merely just that, questions. Hypotheses are testable propositions, ones that lend themselves well to translation to statistical tests. In this session, then, we've examined the research process, and we dug really deep into the first two steps of the research process, formulating research problem and the approach to the problem.